Hi. A few years ago, I started having some really bad headaches. And so at the doctor's request, I ended up going to the opticians. Now, I've been wearing glasses for ages to correct my long distance vision. But the shock came after the eye examination that I now needed them for reading. Yes, shock and horror. The optician said that it was all about part of growing old. The cheek of it! Now, a couple of years on, I've ended up with varifocals because trying to sort of like wear and keep on swapping between two sets of glasses, I've just found too hard to do. And more recently, I found that I'm slowly starting to tilt my head a bit more back, to read the finer text. And sometimes even watching TV, I have to put my finger here like this so that it comes into focus. I guess really what I need to do is visit the opticians again. And I suppose that means I'm a little older now. In our series today, that's exactly what Paul is kind of doing to the Philippian church. So let's just jump straight in there. Get your Bibles out, go to Philippians 1, starting at verse 12, and we'll end at verse 18. This is what it says. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of evil and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And I rejoice because of this. Now you're sitting there wondering, what on earth has that got to do with glasses, let alone varifocals? Well, actually, there's a lot there. Paul was not only trying to correct the Philippians' vision, he was trying to do it through what was happening to him. He was also giving them a vision or a purpose out of what he had learned from being behind bars. And that's just so relevant for us today. When we're under pressure, locked down, when it looks like life is perhaps going south once again, it's often our vision that needs correcting. And guess what? That happens over time. It's not just a one-off event. I have to visit the opticians frequently. John Maxwell, he's a pastor, and I guess some would consider him a leadership guru, says this, that Paul might have been forgiven had he chosen to take a sabbatical as he sat there in prison while awaiting his trial. And we might indeed feel the same about ourselves. Life's in lockdown. Bad things have happened. Hey, we have got an excuse, right? I deserve a break from this. But note this next line, which Maxwell says. And if you write it down, underline it, highlight it. Here it comes. Yet he, that's Paul, used this opportunity to advance the gospel. Paul was a leader that never drifted from his mission. And Paul wanted to get that through to both us and to the Philippians. He was saying, be determined to leave your mark just like I'm determined to leave my mark. Here's another great quote that Maxwell uses. He's quoting George Washington Carver. That guy was a black American scientist. And Carver writes this: "No individual has any right to come into the world and go out of it without leaving behind him distinct and legitimate reasons for having passed through it." Wow. What keeps a person in the battle when they're sat there in prison? What validates them to tutor us and to tutor others from behind bars? What keeps us in the battle when everything is against us? What validates us and our beliefs? I think it's summed up in one short word, and that word is purpose. Now, here's 5 things that we can learn from Paul about purpose, and they all can be found just in this short passage. And I've taken my inspiration from these directly from Maxwell. The Maxwell's points, but I've backfilled in through them. The first point is this: a purpose will motivate you. Look at this. Why was Paul in prison? Paul had done nothing wrong. That's the biggest demotivator there, right out there in the open, in front of us all. Being blamed for something that you didn't do simply because somebody else doesn't like you. How demotivating is that? On top of that, others were preaching the gospel for their own gain, for their own good. Let's just pause again and think about that. Paul is in prison for the sake of preaching the gospel, for the sake of others. Yet some were roaming around preaching for their own good, for their own sake. And on top of that, their actions would be building evidence that could be gathered against Paul's case. This, you would have thought, would have broken and been enough to deter the most strongest of people. But what we read is quite the opposite. Just look at the last few words of Paul in verse 18. He says this: "And because of this, I rejoice." He's not deterred at all. He's celebrating. He's not run out of fuel. He's firing on all cylinders. To use the words of somebody I know, he's pumped up, psyched up, and ready to go. Why? Because he was seeing his purpose fulfilled. In 1 Corinthians 2, right up at the front of that chapter, Paul clearly states his purpose for life. He says, "When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony of God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified." So his purpose was not self-development. It was not to become, well known like all the skillful Greek orators out there for their eloquence. It was not even to be motivated by becoming wise like the Eastern sages and gurus. No, his purpose was to proclaim Jesus, and not just the palatable parts of his story, but the whole of it. That purpose propelled and fueled his motivation. That trimmed his feathers and sharpened his tip, as the arrow of his life flew straight to hit the bullseye of the target. No casual breeze or even a raging storm would ever cause that arrow to swerve off course. A purpose will motivate you. Point 2. A purpose will keep your priorities straight. I don't know about you, but I suspect if you're anything like me, your main priority in life is self-preservation. almost all psychologists would agree that, that's a good primary directive. The protection of those basic needs, the basic needs of food, of water, of warmth, of rest, security and safety, those base layers of needs that are identified in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that base layer there in the triangle. Yet Paul doesn't mention any of these needs at all. I would have thought that being under house arrest, he would have probably had food provided for him and shelter. But that may not have been the case. After all, it's a fairly modern practice that in prisons that is supplied for the inmates. It always used to be up to close relatives to fulfill the food and clothing needs of the prisoners. I should also imagine that his security and safety was also at risk here. You see, that palace guard, I suspect, would have first had quite strong opinions by Paul. I mean, why would they believe him over known collaborators, over peers that were saying things? And prison guards can provide that need for personal security for the inmate. Or actually, if they just decide to turn their head a little, move their eyes away, casually look in another direction, they can provide your death sentence. Again, look at verse 18. Paul says this: the important thing, number one of Paul's priority, in every way, Christ is preached. This guy was well focused. But what about you? What about me? Where do our priorities lie? Like the inmate in prison, can we trust our relatives, our close friends, our co-conspirators to provide for our basic needs while we keep that focus? As the family of God, we should be able to do that. Not being distracted from our life goals that we've determined by our faith and our relationship with Jesus. When every basic earthly foundation in our life is shaken, it's hard to get those priorities right. It's hard to do, but it is possible. We are told in Ephesians, let me get my teeth in Ephesians, that Jesus is our cornerstone. He is our firm foundation. He's the solid rock on which we stand. Something that we can see Paul so clearly displaying here in his letter to the Philippians. Paul's non-negotiables, his priority of sharing the gospel, caused the rest of his life just to fall in place. You see, he wasn't being driven by needs, but by purpose. And a purpose will keep your priorities straight. Number 3, a purpose will give you power to live in the present. There's an old Indian proverb, and it reads like this: yesterday is but a dream, tomorrow is but a vision. Each day well lived makes yesterday a dream of happiness, and every tomorrow a vision of hope. Think well, therefore, today. Look, there's not much you can do about yesterday. It's happened, it's gone. And who knows about tomorrow? For many of us, it's just too far in the future. That just leaves today. So make the most of it. Use what you have in your hands according to the purposes you are destined for. There are loads of times in the Bible where reference is made to a person's hands. And God uses what is in our hands. People are healed, they are blessed, and they are filled by God every day by using what is in our hands. It's by our our present disposition, by our current placement, by our current location, GPS coordinates, if you like, that God brings about his purposes through us. In the now, in today, this allows us, like Paul, to thrive and not just survive. And I don't know about you, but I want to thrive. Survival is just, so mundane. But we see through Paul living in the present, working out his purpose in his now with the entire palace guard. And by the way, that's the Praetorian guard. That's a massive elite specialist guard formed for the protection of the emperor at the time. At one point in time, that force was about 10,000 soldiers. Now, I'm not sure if that was the number that was there in Paul's time or not when he was under house arrest. But I tell you what, there was definitely a lot of them, because according to Roman documents at the time, there was a garrison on the edge of the city and it was full of soldiers. Those soldiers knew his trumped up charges. They knew the real reason for his arrest. And I guarantee you that by the end of their shift, they knew the gospel too. The power of purpose didn't cause Paul to hide or back off. No, instead it put his life out there on display. He could have been afraid, he could have been intimidated at such a formidable audience. But no, instead a garrison of soldiers, elite soldiers, became a captive audience for the gospel. That same power enabled him to deal with a potentially crushing other dilemma too. The dilemma of handling the politics and power swings of some people preaching Christ out of envy and out of rivalry. That's the power of purpose to live in and through the now, the today. The power to thrive and not just survive. You ready for point 4? Here it comes. A purpose will develop your potential. It will develop my potential. Paul's sheer potential for change was multiplied and magnified through these circumstances. As we continue to read in verse 14, Paul writes this, "And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters," remember, that was the church at that time, "had become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear." Just to underline that's the entire future church is empowered because of Paul walking in his purpose. Charles Stanley says that your potential is the sum of all your possibilities God has for your life. Wow. Just wow. We need to pay particular attention to this. God has packaged in you a dynamic bundle that is able to transform not just your world, but the world around you too. Do you see it? Perhaps this quote from Winston Churchill may help us a little further in this. He says continuous effort, not strength, not intelligence, is the key to unlocking our or your potential. It's not about place, it's not about position, sheer might, or training. It's all about the potential of continuous effort. That continuous plodding day after day along the journey of what you believe your purpose to be. Paul's potential grew to change, a whole barrack full of elite guards, possibly even their households. He motivated the church from fear to faith. He even speaks to us now, centuries in the future. That's how much purpose can develop your potential. Last point, number 5. A purpose will help you evaluate your progress. The motivational speaker Zig Ziglar has this famous quote. You'll have heard it before. If you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time. In other words, having a purpose helps you set a target, it helps you set goals, a place where you want to get to, a desire that you want to achieve. It gives you a tangible, a fixed point, somewhere out there in space. It gives you a way of getting there, a focus, a journey. You know, in maths, we call that a vector. It's kind of a point out here that's an X and a Y, and we're here at a different X and a Y, and we can set a point and travel between it. And as we travel between it, we travel at a certain speed in a certain direction, and we can measure that. That becomes measurable. You know, if we say that that kind of a vector is equal to purpose, you know, it means that purpose becomes measurable. We can measure how fast we get in there, how we're far away from it. Are we heading in the right direction? Paul was able to measure his progress. And his end point is this, that Christ is preached. And you know, he evaluates that when he says, whether from false or whether from true motives. And the result of that evaluation is his elation, his joyful, his rejoicing. His fulfillment of purpose fuels that rejoicing. You know, we can learn just so much from these few verses, but let's not forget that he's writing to a church plant, and it's a church plant that's going well. He's encouraging them. And he knows that if they act on their purpose, no matter what their current conditions are, they can and they will change the world around them. And he's encouraging us the same way too. And you know, that brings us full circle back to where I started. Paul wants us to know that despite our current position and regardless of our circumstances, God's purpose will be worked out through us. Those Philippians, you know, they would have been scared and they would have been frightened. They had seen their mentor thrown into prison, locked away under an elite guard. You know, they thought that could happen to them at any moment themselves. And Paul needed to refocus them to make things plain and clear for them to see again. To make it clear that the purpose of the gospel is unstoppable. So we can be encouraged, you know, that the unique purpose God has placed in our hearts won't fail. It'll motivate you. It will help you set your priorities. It'll ground you in the now. It'll magnify or grow your potential. And it'll end up in you rejoicing as you kind of evaluate that process. So here we go. Why not change your specs? Get your eyes tested. Get a new prescription and see clearly the purposes God has for you. See you next time.
Oh, wow. I don't know about you, but there's a lot to take in there. And I was thinking about the season that we're in, and, you know, whatever's going on in your life, wherever you're at now, whether you may be behind bars as Paul was, I think the encouragement is that we haven't just got to survive. We can survive, but we haven't just got to survive, but that God is with us in every situation. And you might not feel that you're making a difference, but you can live for God exactly where you're at. If Paul could live for God in that prison, then we have that opportunity too. If all of that was done through Paul being obedient to God in that circumstance, then what can God do in you and in me in our circumstances today? God has a purpose for us. He is with us. Whether we see the success or whether we don't, He's with us and He loves us and He wants the best for us. So let's pray. So Jesus, I thank you for your amazing love I thank you that you love every single person and that each person has value and worth right where they are, right in this situation now. And I pray that you would help each one of us to see clearly through new lenses, a perspective on life right now and the purpose you have for us and through us. In Jesus' name, amen. So it's great to see you today, and I'll just don't forget that you can go onto the website and actually join into some of the groups and actually maybe discuss this more. Say, no, I don't agree, Rob, or yes, I do, and have an opportunity to discuss in a non-threatening environment and go on that journey. It'd be great to see you. Take care.